Well, Scraper Wiki is not only a fantastic project, but what drew me to it was its heritage. Because the people who built Scraper Wiki have a background in being these sort of developers that just wanted to do something and just went out and did it. And they didn't necessarily have a job or business model or a user base. So the person who first wrote Scraper Wiki actually made something called the public whip, which he wanted to know how his local MP voted in the Iraq War. And if you go to our Parliament site, Hansard, it just lists off all these motions and the yays and nays. And the Iraq War was not one motion, it was a set of 5 different motions. It takes time to get through. And so that is not human readable, but it is machine readable. And that's what he did. He scraped the whole of Hansard, he produced an algorithm where you can look at your MP and you can say how they voted for the Iraq War, for gay marriage, for smoking ban. And, that's what they want. And I realized that that is really what is the key to data journalism is we need to find things which will enhance our understanding of current affairs where it's now in the machine readable format but not a human readable format. We need to take it out of machine readable format, and we need to translate it not by machine but by human concept and thinking of what is important, what do we need to do, what can we use. And therefore you are adding to a certain extent what they call like civic journalism, sites where they build where people can talk about their public transport system and alert things, and where they can interact and feel that not only are they're just consuming news, that there's just something's thrown at them and they're trying to understand it, but there's a feedback where they can interact with it and they can act upon it. And so they have a background in trying to empower people with information to do things that's civic and at a local level. And so they have a background in things like They Work For You and the Public Whip and What Do They Know, the group called My Society, which spun off the Sunlight Foundation in the US. And so that really attracted me to it. And then I realized that the power of journalism in terms of getting a really good understanding, really good story, is actually mostly scraping. It's not something that someone's going to give you that's easy to use. A lot of it is actually government data, and it's very, very badly structured. And sadly, there just isn't the resources and the time for a big investigative unit to hire people or have 5 interns to go and do things by hand. So I'm trying to think of data journalism as more of an investigative branch of a news organization, where we are trying to cut down on that time and person effort by writing building scripts that will do what our interns should be doing. I would not say that to be a data journalist, to get interested in it, you have to start coding. It is a big learning curve. It is a huge dedication. Any developer knows that they spend their whole life learning. You don't just learn one language, it gets deprecated, libraries are built up. You're the community that builds the coding language that you're doing, then finds a fashionable new one and they all go to that, and then you have to relearn that. It's a big dedication. But I think in terms of being a journalist and getting big newsroom experience is hugely valuable to you, because you end up picking up things such as you interview enough people, you know when someone is lying to you, or that instance where you're looking at something, you're reading something, and something clicks that that's not right. We need to go and find it out. We need to ask these questions, which leads to a story. Now, more and more, that information is going to be a deluge of bits and bytes. And to be able to have that click is to be able to translate that machine readable format to human readable format, to be build up this sixth sense of when there's something in it and when there's something to it. And to a certain extent, getting tons and tons of things and doing it by hand and putting it into Excel and looking at it, that's actually, even though the learning curve is much smaller for that, it's actually not as beneficial in the long term. In that I think if you can code, then you know exactly what you're looking for and you can rewrite it, make it more efficient, and then keep on running it, keep on running it, keep on running it until something sparks. And then once you understand what that spark is, that's the piece of code, that's the intern that's getting the story for you, and you concentrate on that. And then you can apply that to other and different places, being able to build on almost like a sixth sense that journalists have of there's something to this. You need to kind of be able to pick up in terms of data and the information coming, there's something to this. And no software will help you build that understanding because they mask that in what they do. A lot of it is behaviors. And just by having to pick apart and understand its behavior, you're able to build something. So what I say is I want journalists to be able to train their nose for data, not just for interviews and things that come across their way. Okay, things that come across their way that's machine readable, I can help with that. I can try and make it understandable. I can translate it to them. But I need them to be able to, when things come their way, notice that it is data and be able to send it to me. Because in a data journalism unit, what you need is you need more people looking for sources of information. Yes, that's the reason why I decided to actually go out of the newsroom and join Scraper Wiki in order to learn to code, because I trained as a journalist and actually as a broadcast journalist. And I was working at CNN International, and I ended up gathering a lot of information that weren't on the wires through social media, finding pictures, finding video, and actually finding people who are there on the ground so that we can get them up on the news before our actual correspondents managed to get there on the ground. And I ended up using a plethora of tools that were built on top of Twitter, because at that point in time, there were tons and tons and tons of little widgets, and everyone in San Francisco seemed to have had something that dealt with the Twitter stream. The problem was is that I was using these tools, and these tools would change on me. They would end up pivoting and becoming something else. Different usages and functions of them disappeared, changed with A/B testing, and I had no control over it. And I liken it to going out in the field with a different camera each day, and sometimes that camera is a HD camera, sometimes it uses tape, sometimes it uses something else. It's like having your own equipment change on you, and that's hugely frustrating. I think part of the fact that the journalist is relied on to do their own checks and balances, to be that partial person, to be the person that is searching for the truth and is not trying to bend anything to their own will. If that falls on you, then also I think in terms of control, in terms of just being really, really paranoid, I prefer to be able to do it in code so I can see what each and everything does. And so, I say things like even looking at the data through software changes it. So for instance, you'll see that if you put something into Google spreadsheets and it's in a UK date-time format, it will try and make it into a US date-time format if it can be, and then it will leave it. So it changes what it is on you, because actually uploading something into a piece of software, they already manipulate what the original source was. And so just being able to say, I'm going to look at this in a text edit, in its raw format first, is just very, very important. It's just like saying, I'm going to talk to this politician not in their office, not where they have control and power, but I'm going to actually bring them out somewhere else, take them out of their comfort zone, out of their politician's hat, and try and talk to them as a person and see what they say. So yes, one of the reasons why I learned to code was because I couldn't rely on these tools not to change and not to make mistakes as well, because what has happened previously is, to a certain extent, things like Google's spreadsheet and Excel have a limit to the amount of data that they can take. And if you try and upload something bigger than that, it will not tell you that your original file is larger than what it can show you. It will just show you what it can, and it will cut it off. And this actually happened with the Iraq war logs as well, that it had been the journalist had looked at it in Excel, and it had cut off, and then quite an old version of it, and it cut off what it could actually show. And to a certain extent, I think you want to code because you want to be future-proof as a journalist. I think every traditional journalist should know now that it's actually really important to be future-proof, because your industry is changing. If we're working in the same area as developers now, the web changes every 3 months. You have to think that you have to kind of have your skill set such that it is malleable and you can adjust it every 3 months. And to a certain extent, the reason why is because I want to be able to start handling large enough data that things like Google spreadsheets will break and it's far too slow, or things like Excel will break and it's far too slow. And then to be able as well, just to be able to tie it in properly, because at the end of the day, what you want to do with data is to have it also keep it digitized. Don't have it in machine readable format. You want it such that it can be converted to JSON and then put into a lovely interactive or visualization. And so that means, whatever manipulation, you want to spit out code at the end. So I just think it's difficult. It's a learning curve, but I think it's worth it if you actually think like, I need to be future proof and I need to be connected completely with the story from the beginning to the end, from its source to its analysis to its understanding to the actual output, and that you need to work on that in iterative format, not in a straightforward format, because you'll go back, you'll find something different with the source, then the story will change, and then the interactive needs to change. You need to be responsive in that sense. So it means if you use a piece of software, you're doing that work again and again. If you're coding it, it's an iteration. You just run the same piece of code on the new update, and that should spit out the JSON, and that should update the interactive as well. Well, what I say is there is a good reason why I code in Python is because Scraper Wiki are Pythonists. So you'll always have heritage. To a certain extent, a lot of the newsrooms in America that had people who were part of the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporters were Pythonists. So it depends on when that language is fashionable, and it entered the newsroom. It became fashionable in the newsroom in the US when Python was quite fashionable, but the UK was actually a bit behind, and it became quite fashionable when Ruby was actually quite fashionable. So you will find actually most UK institutions are Rubyists. In terms of scraping, it's Ruby or Python are the object-oriented programming languages that have libraries specifically for dealing with information on the web and scraping it. The reason why I'm a Pythonist is not just because I was taught by Pythonists, because they also knew Ruby as well, and they have their factions and they have their loyalties. But the interesting thing is, like with programming languages, you have a community around that. And what I find the difference between Python and Ruby is that Ruby is actually more webby, which is why it's being adopted more and more in newsrooms than Python, whereas Python is more data-y. So Python has more of a standing and a foothold in the scientific community and in the data science community, communities that use statistics and want to do a lot of analysis. There's a lot of libraries being built on that, whereas Ruby have Ruby on Rails, which is much more based on making modules and making things on the web. To a certain extent, all sites are scrapable, just some make it horrendously difficult for you, and some use different scraping libraries. So there's ones that you actually have to send a form out. You have to fill in a form and send it out, and then they actually give it back to you. There's a library that deals with that in Python, and I'm sure there is one in Ruby as well. It's sort of being able to see what is easy to scrape is ones where whenever you get the data, the URL changes. Because then you can just go and you understand how that URL is built, the page number is back on there. Those are usually the much more easiest ones to scrape. Sometimes the actual site will log you in, log you off, and they will put captchas and things. And it's, like I said in the course, scraping is solving a problem. It is solving a puzzle. No two things are ever alike. You're actually trying to deconstruct things. So even if there is a captcha in it, what you do is you realize that captchas are on randomly associated ones that they send out to you as a user. They're not constantly on the exact same one. So what you do is whenever you're writing your piece of code, you have something that logs saying this one is a captcha, send it to this other thing that runs it again and then tries to get it out, send it back. If it's a captcha, keep it in there, send it out. You just had to rerun things over and over again. I did end up trying to scrape a site that was just really, really badly constructed, such that whenever you went to search and you got a search result for it, it actually made you a user, and it had URLs, a limited amount of URLs that it assigned to the results. And once you actually looked through more than their assigned URLs, it logged you off, logged you back in again, and reassigned those URLs, such that there was nothing unique to each entry. For that, there was actually nothing you can do, because to a certain extent, when journalism-wise, you can't say you've gotten everything. And for that thing, I was trying to do something quantitative rather than qualitative. So a lot of times, like, it depends on what you want from it. It depends on how determined you are. It depends on your problem solving abilities as well as your coding abilities. A lot of the times it's building your skill set, is also building your awareness of what libraries is out there, what other people have done, what other people can do. A lot of it actually, and this is where traditional journalism is becoming digital journalism, is community building. Developers have to have a community of people that they can ask questions to. Stack Overflow is the most amazing community in the world because, this is where if you have a problem, someone else has had it and someone else has answered it. And that's absolutely amazing. And I wish journalists could get their users and the public on board with them as much as the developer community have helped each other out. It's a case-by-case basis. A lot of the times, it's a matter of working out how difficult it is to scrape. But when I say when something is scrapable or not, it's a matter of, are you trying to get everything? How difficult are they making it for you to get everything? Sometimes they do make it difficult, and sometimes they're just such a badly constructed site that their own architecture is really, really poor. In that case, sometimes you just phone up FOI and ask for it. In other extents, if the site is that bad, it's probably not worth getting to begin with, because they're probably not monitoring and putting things on correctly and updating things if their site is so poor and they've not invested in it. More and more as the web changes, I think, as the semantic web comes on and linked data, it actually is going to be much more scrapable and much more usable. So the site that I showed you, that was one of the cleanest government websites, because you're like, this actually comes from a properly filled out database. And although it looks like that is really difficult to get because there's a drop down menu and things reveal, it's there in the code. That's one of the easiest things to actually get. So it's a matter of trial and error. It's also thinking about what you want to get, what you want it for. Commercial stuff, so a lot of scrapers are out there on the web, there's a lot of bots scraping stuff, they will block you, they'll block your IP address because you're taking a lot of their server time and they know what you're up to. So that when I say like scrapable, they can make it unscrapable for you by blocking your IP. Yeah, that was the site that ended up giving the same URL for the same search result just by logging you off and logging you on again. And it was such a bad site that even one scraper would end up taking it down and accidentally DDoS attacking it. Yeah, it was just such a bad website. And you're like, if this is supposed to be for the whole of Europe, clearly there's not that many people on it and not many people aware of it. If, 3 hits a second can take it down. They asked it to begin with before they even asked me to take a look at it and try and scrape it. They asked it to begin with, and they're just being hugely difficult. And possibly it's not just because it's bad bureaucracy or they're hiding something in it. Possibly because it's near impossible for them to take it out because the site is structured really badly. A lot of the time, sometimes it's difficult for them to get because they are not responsible for their own website and their own database, and another company does it, and that's probably why it's quite bad. I know the UK government is taking more and more stuff in-house and taking more control because they want to use the data themselves. And the better they get at managing their own digital infrastructure, the better it will be for people like us who want to go and actually make it quite usable. But at the end of the day, if it's difficult, it doesn't mean don't do it. But if it's difficult, it doesn't mean that it's worth doing, because it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a story in there. You have to understand why certain things are difficult. It doesn't mean they're trying to hide something. It just means that they have no one in their institute who understands how to make a good website. And there's a lot of places like that, especially in government. Yes, it's the same thing. It's like it's worth more to you out in the open than kept behind a walled garden, that kept behind closed doors, because code will deprecate and die. A lot of the times it's impossible to get someone to steal something from you. There was this thing about startups making their code and their idea open source, and someone actually wrote down in a blog, I dare you to try and get someone to steal your idea and your code. ScraperWiki was open source. It's near impossible because no one can read your code and understand your idea of your product and understand how you're using it. it's reading that booklet of changes that's near impossible. And a lot of the times code to begin with is just really horrible and messy. That's not worth anything. And even if you use it over and over again, you're using it for your ideas, which is not transparent in the code. You're building something because you're like, we're going to use it to do this process over and over again. And that process is the journalism within your organization, which is not transparent from it. But if you hand it out to the community and they use it for something else, they will come back to you if they find something interesting, because you've given something to them, you've given them an ability, just like a journalist has done a really, really good report and has given someone an understanding of a key issue which they vote for in a referendum. That is what they really value. They will go onto that site and they will take part in their polls and they will add comments and they'll get involved in a community there. I think rather than fanciful visualizations, if you actually hand out stuff, code, even though the community is much smaller because it's a very advanced, very high skill base, those people, they interact with data on a daily basis, or to a certain extent, you find people like the people from Scraper Wiki and My Society who are building stuff for the public out of their own time and their own goodwill and their own heart, because that's how a lot of developers stay on top of the game and stay on top of a thing. Is you don't sit there and you read a book, you build something, and that's how you learn the mistakes. And you need to get in contact with, rather than what information is out there, what is someone building. And it could be that these people actually work within organizations and have access to information and hear the gossip and have their ears out, and they really don't like what's going on, and they could send something to you and say, I know there is something in this, I know that this whatever department says that they are doing this and they are monitoring this, but they haven't asked me. They haven't asked me to pull out the data ever. In fact, they've made sure that it's on an FTP site that's really, really difficult, and they haven't asked for any numbers or statistics. So here it is. Go and check and see, and make them look bad. And especially if it's public. If it's public, you're not a whistleblower to a certain extent. You're not stealing any private information. So being able to have that and do that is one way to whistleblow without having any suspicion whatsoever. Because you can just say, well, our journalists thought to take a look at it, we scraped it, and we did some analysis on it, and we can tell you're lying. So being able to work with people that actually, to a certain extent, know what's in their nose part of the story first, that either don't want to put it on their own site, or, to a certain extent, don't want to sift through what a lot of the journalists have to do, spend a lot of time and effort cleaning stuff up by hand, because you will have to do that at some point. I've yet to come across any data journalism story where you didn't have to do parts of it by hand. And they don't want to do that. They'll let you do that. If there isn't, it's not worth doing. To a certain extent, it means someone has cleaned it for you, it means someone has prepared it for you, and you're packaging on top. It's the whole thing between journalism and journalism. The data journalism will always involve something that's nasty. But to a certain extent, stuff that people did in the past with documents which they scanned in, or they got people to go through by hand and build up a database. Yes, we get stuff in PDFs, but people are building things now where you can OCR things, try and scrape it and try and build it that way. Things like the Overview project, things like pandas that are coming out and being built. It's because they know it's a hairy and a horrible mess, but it's still going to be stuff you have to do by hand. It's just less hairy, less horrible, less time consuming, and to a certain extent less people time, wages, and to a certain extent interns and stuff like that. But also it's much more trustworthy, because if you have a group of interns building up a database and you get a story from it, if someone then complains, they're like, well, where do you get this from? And we said, we got interns to do this. They're like, well, check again. You have to pay for everyone to do that again. If you have the piece of code where, like, here's the code, get someone who reads code to understand, to make sure that it isn't, there's an if statement saying if this person named appears, don't put it in the database, etc., and run it again, and just run it again. And, we can show straight away that we've done our checks and balances without having to go through a really difficult, time-consuming process that at the end of the day is not transparent. It's try and make it as transparent as possible, just so that you can reuse it again, you can send it out to the community, but also if people complain or want to check and see, outside parties, government departments, companies want to double check that you've, want to see if they can actually stop you from it going to press, stop you from building anything on top of it, or sue you for defamation, saying this is affecting our business, we're losing customers, this is, very bad press and it's a lie. You can go and say, well, it's not a lie because it's built off of this.